Hey everybody, it's Dave Dugdale, learningvideo.com. Thank you so much for purchasing this course. After watching this course, you'll be able to match up 2 different cameras without having to be a professional colorist. And that's an important concept because I think a lot of you out there shoot and edit your own material and don't color grade for a living every single day. So it can be extremely difficult sometimes to match up 2 different cameras. We're going to be concentrating on Canon and Sony for this particular course. So why these 2 particular brands? I came from a Canon background, really enjoyed using the Canon, love the colors, but Sony came out with a lot of great features like 4K, a lot of different things that I really enjoyed using on here, but I didn't like the colors as much. That's the reason why we're matching these 2. This is just my personal preference of the cameras I've been using, but you could use this workflow for anything from matching a GoPro to a GH5, a GH5 to a Sony, a Canon to a Fuji. Doesn't really matter. This course is going to center around using DaVinci Resolve. I'm not saying you can't match cameras with either Premiere Pro's Lumetri panel or Final Cut. There's a lot of great tools in both of those. However, with DaVinci Resolve, there's just a few more advanced features that it has that can get us really, really close, just like that extra last mile, and get us to the point where you look at both of them and you're thinking, it looks like they're shot from the same camera. All right, if you own 2 cameras, I'm kind of expecting your level of experience to be somewhat intermediate to advanced. Maybe you've been doing this for a few years. You do interviews, you do testimonials, you do corporate videos, weddings, whatever it is. I kind of am expecting you to understand the difference between a vector scope and a waveform monitor. I'm not gonna be able to have time to explain all that different stuff in this course because I want to keep the momentum of the color matches going. I don't want to be stopping and say, well, you could white balance this way, or you can white balance this way, or you can white balance this way. There's a lot of different ways to do just about everything in Resolve. If you need further information, there's some great courses out there. Lexus Van Herkman's got some titles on Ripple training that are hours and hours long. That'll teach you just about everything you ever wanted to know in Resolve. There's also lynda.com. Patrick Inhofer's got some great courses. I think I've watched pretty much all of them. So after our first color match, you might be thinking, well, we just transformed the Sony to have Canon colors, and can't we just create a LUT from that? Next time I use my Sony camera, I'll just apply that LUT and get the perfect Canon colors that I like. No, it doesn't work that way. LUTs, unfortunately, don't work on all different shots. One of the biggest reasons is exposure. I have no idea how you're going to expose. Maybe you're the type of person that likes to underexpose all the time. I'm shooting this on the Sony a7R II right now, and exposing this white, it's not the way you're seeing it now because I've actually brought it down, but this white at the time of recording is almost like at 100 IRE, which is pretty high. So I have no idea how you're going to expose. So when you expose maybe differently than I do and you apply that LUT, it might just look awful. This course is really about matching 2 different shots, not really about generating the perfect LUT. All right, I'm gonna try to remove as much art from this process as possible and make it as scientific and, for you, repeatable. What do I mean by that? So when I've watched other people's courses and they'll say, oh, I'm gonna move this a little bit this way because it feels right. And yeah, it might look great, but why? Why did you move it that direction? Why didn't you move the opposite direction? Why are you doing that to begin with? And they said it's just by feel. In this case, we can be very scientific because we're matching one video signal to another. And I guess we call it required course material, but you're gonna need a device like this. Now, professional colorists, they don't get this in the frame. It's out of the frame, and they know how to match cameras quite well because they've been doing it for so long. But for us, if you're starting out or if you're even at my level of experience, I use this, I love it. It's a great tool. It'll get you there a lot faster. So this is the X-Rite Color Checker Video. It's around $120. This one is made by DSC Labs. It's called the One Shot. Picked it up on the Simpty site. It's like $99 or $100. This one has faded over time. It's gotten older. The reason I wouldn't advise using this one is because when we build contrast between the 2 cameras and we're comparing them, we're gonna be using these white through black patches. All right, the last thing I wanna say before we get started is you might be saying, all right, we're working in Resolve, but I like to work in Premiere Pro or Final Cut. How do I get over there after we've been working in Resolve? Basically, what we'll do is match up the 2 different cameras, getting lucky as close as we can. We'll generate a LUT from there, and then you'll bring it in that LUT into your nonlinear editor of choice, apply the LUT, and you'll get the same color match. All right, let's do our first camera match. So Canon is always going to be on the left. This is the 5D Mark IV. Sony on the right, A7R2. I'm not going to always have these text on the top because it kind of interferes with the scopes. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that off now. Just remember that the Canon, our reference, will always be on the left. Sony will always be on the right. Now you're looking at this already and you're saying, Dave, looks like you kind of underexposed the Sony. Well, not really. This is going to become one of the first things we're going to notice about these two different cameras. This was shot, the Canon was shot in standard picture profile, and the contrast was turned all the way down. Sony, same thing, standard, and they both match up in terms of colors. That's why I shot them that way. If you shoot some in like Vivid or Autumn or some of the other ones, these colors that you see right here won't line up as well, and we'll be talking more about that later. All right, one of the first things we're going to do is go ahead and isolate the chart. Now I've just isolated just the white, the gray, and the black patches so you can see them. And what you'll notice is the white patch and this white patch are actually not that far off. They're pretty darn close. And that's how I kind of exposed them, is to have white around 90 IRE. Whereas the gray you can see is much, much lower than the Canon, a lot lower. So the first thing what we're going to do in our workflow, and just to help follow along on this workflow, is I'm going to have different nodes. Right here that you can see all the nodes that I've created. Nothing's going on inside these nodes quite yet. And the very first one you see is levels. And what I need to do is get these levels to somewhat match. So that's what I'm going to do right now, is I'm going to bring up the curves adjustment. I'm going to push a move right about here in the midtones, bring that all the way up, and then we'll bring the highlights down a bit. Now these two somewhat match. You don't have to spend too much time on this particular part of the step. You just need to get close. The part we're going to go to next is white balance. Now, if these signals, like one of them was very low, and you did all your white balance on it, and then you stretch the signal out to where you like the way it looks, well, you're going to have to redo the white balance again, because maybe the whites were so far down, all those adjustments you made in the highlights weren't really affecting it much. And then when you stretch it back out again, you're like, oh, I have to redo it again. So that's what we kind of want to avoid here, is like retracing our steps, going back and forth on these different nodes that I've set up. We're going to have to do that some, but I want to eliminate as much as we can. So very first step is to get these matched up. All right, versus node, I'm actually going to skip this. I'll talk more about this after white balance, actually. Next up is white balance. I custom white balance both of these cameras to white, so they're very, very close. If you had under mixed lighting or something like that, yours might look more like this, and where you got more white balance to do. I don't have that much white balance to do because I custom white balance. If you're doing like an interview, it only takes a second, but white balance both cameras, custom white balance both cameras, and you'll be having not that much work to do here, which is great. So what I'm going to do is going to start on the outer edges, the highlights and the shadows first, and then we work toward the midtones. Sometimes when you work this way, highlights, shadows, the midtones kind of correct themselves. It just makes it a little bit faster. So the first thing I'm going to do is the highlights. It kind of looks like we have a red push here slightly. I'm just going to pull this ever so slightly. Reds down. Yep, looks a lot cleaner right there. The blacks look great already. I don't have to do much there. Midtones, they have a blue push going upward. And I know this doesn't look like much, but man, you're just going to pull this more towards red, like right about there. And then you can see the highlights actually went up to red again. So I'll pull the red out a little bit. And now it looks like we have a properly white balanced image, both in the highlights, the midtones, and the shadows. Think of it like you're building a house or a shed, let's say. Think of the foundation as your X-Rite chart. And as you build the walls and the ceiling, the roof, and then you're putting in the shingles, the last thing you want to be doing is hammering the shingles and say, you know what? I need to go back to the foundation and lower that right-hand corner down 2 inches. Well, if you do that, then the whole house, you almost have to rebuild the whole house again. So that's what we don't want to do. We don't want to be like chasing our tail, going back and forth all the time. So spend a lot of time white balance, make sure you've got it nailed. It'll make everything else go a lot smoother. All right, next up, we're gonna work on the versus node. First thing I'm gonna do is take the bottom and relax that so we can see these chips that are on the bottom. the ones that do not have color. All right, now that we've got both isolated, you're going to see that we've got this black patch up here. That's represented by this tiny little shelf that you see right here. Same thing with the Canon. But what we see here is we've got kind of some colors going on here where we can see the Canon is very neutral. And that comes up to our next difference between Canon and Sony is Canon doesn't have as much saturation in the highlights and the shadows compared to Sony. So we're going to have to do something about that, clean it up. So we're going to go to, there's two controls in Resolve that's called Sat versus Sat, and there's another one called Loom versus Sat. And that's why I called this node versus, because they both have the name versus. And sometimes it's just hard to write a whole bunch of descriptive stuff up here in the label for the node. So the best way I can describe what's going on here with these black patches and why these have more color in them than the Canon is to show you this right here. You can see I've got two digital clock light sources, and I've shot a lot of stuff around the house trying to figure out what was going on, and shooting light sources really helped me out understand what was going on between the Canon and the Sony. Canon on the left, Sony on the right. You can see this blue line that kind of arcs up and comes down. Well, that's kind of like that glow that you see around the clock itself. You can see there's less glow over here in the shadows. So what we've got here is luminance versus saturation. So you can create control points anywhere on the graph. I'm just going to create two right here, for instance. And you can see this hump that's going on here. Well, basically what's happening here with this particular control is I can bring down the saturation in the shadows. See what's happening right here? You can see that bump right there is coming down and matching the Canon a lot better. So basically the Sony camera is too saturated in the shadow areas, and it's also too saturated in the highlights as well. So one of the things I do is I bring this down like that. All right, next up we have another light source. These are actually hue lights that I can change the color and the saturation of them. They're pretty cool. This control right here is saturation versus saturation. Think of it this way. Down here are the least saturated items of the image, and think up here are the most saturated items. And in the lights, this light source, the most saturated item is the bulb itself that you can see here, and that's represented by this hump right here. So if I were to put a control point right here, let's say, and I were to bring this down slightly, you can see I'm actually bringing down the most saturated part of the image. And down here you can see this red area that's a little bit higher in the blacks, and this is the least saturated parts. I can actually do the same thing. I'm just going to bring down the least saturated items and bring those down as well. So going back to our first color match, we basically want to get rid of some of this saturation in the shadows. So we're going to go to the luminance versus saturation control, put a control point in, and then we're going to bring it down. Now as you can see, it's cleaning up that area right there. And the same thing we're going to do is for the highlights, we're going to bring this down as well. You're going to notice nothing changed up here because there's nothing all the way up in that extreme white area. And basically, as a rule of thumb, so you don't run into problems, is I basically, so there's blocks. I go 1, 2, 3. I'll bring it down 3, and I'll do this the same thing over here. 1, 2, 3. So I'll bring them 3 down on each side. And the same thing with saturation versus saturation. I will bring the least saturated items down 3, and I will bring the most saturated items down 3 as well. If you keep it around 3, you're gonna be fine. If you start going more than that, you can actually tear apart the image. You'll start noticing some funky things. So I would start there, and if you need to take out more, you can definitely take it out, but definitely review the image. With just coming down 3 on either side, you'll be safe from any artifacts. So let's review what we did. I'm just going to disable and enable this versus node. So I'm going to disable now. And look at the shadows, and you can see the shadows are cleaning up. But also look at the highlights. Those are also cleaning up a little bit as well. So they're starting to match more of what we see on the Canon side. All right, now we're onto the contrast node. I'm just going to relax the bottom, and we're going to reveal these bottom chips. We'll do the same for the Canon. We'll bring the scopes over, make sure we're on the Sony camera, and we're going to take a look. We're fairly close from what we did back on the levels node, but we still have more work to do and really need to spend a lot of time on this. So what we're going to do, my workflow here, to make it as simple as possible, is we're going to be matching up like this shelf to this shelf first. And I usually start right in the middle. So basically I work in the middle, I have it again. We're going to actually add about 6 points, which lines up pretty well with all of these patches. First thing to do, if you don't know where things are, just kind of move it around until you find it. And you're like, oh, I can see what it's affecting. And it's basically this one right here. Then I chop it in half on the bottom. And then I just start wiggling it around and see where that matches up. And then I have it again. You can see this wants to be pulled down a little bit. And then I have these two parts. And then I can see what that's affecting. And then I have it again. And this feels like it wants to come down a little bit here. And then I have it again. You can see this one right here is lining up with that one. And then I have it again. And then typically once I've got that started, I go back and redo. So I'm going to start at the bottom. Next one. Now this is going to seem like very minor changes, but we're actually doing some work here. And what we're looking for is a very nice smooth contour. Like we've done a lot of work already right here in the levels adjustment so we could get the white balance. But in this one, you can see we're not doing that much work. But what we're looking for is a nice smooth contour. So what does that basically look like? So what I'm going to do is relax the crop on here, and I'll relax the crop on the Canon. As you can see, we're getting a lot closer. But I want you to notice is when we go back to the Sony and we're on the contrast node, let's zoom way in on the skin. And one of the dangers of doing this is if you're off just by a little bit, you can actually break the skin. What do I mean by that? Let's say this particular point right here, which is very much in the skin tone. I'm just going to increase it and put up quite a bit of bump in here. You see what happened to her skin right here is it's breaking apart. I don't know if it's called banding or whatever, but the skin tones there's large differences between the skin tones. Now if I go the opposite direction, you can kind of see what's going on there. So basically what we want is we want this nice smooth contour. We don't want something that looks like that or kind of inverted contrast like that as well. All right, if you're doing an interview and you've got plenty of time, you've probably custom white balanced. And if you custom white balance, your white balance is going to be pretty close. Now, in terms of percentages of all like these nodes that we've got on here, contrast I would say is probably 80% of your work. You get 80% of your difference when you kind of toggle it on and off. Now we can toggle on and off the contrast node, and we can see there's definitely some difference there. But that's really not the full piece of the puzzle, because the level adjustment, you see that big bell curve that we brought it up quite a bit. That is also part of contrast. So if we turn both the contrast and the levels node, remember we had to do the levels node just so we could get the white balance done correctly. But we turned both of them off. You can see there's a massive difference right there. We turn them both back on. I'd say that's about 80% of the work. Now, that levels adjustment you see in the levels where we brought it up, basically when you bring up the levels like that, you're going to lose saturation. And you can see this definitely. See the Canon has way more saturation than the Sony. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the saturation node. And this is going to be about maybe 10-15% of our work. We get to the last node, color node, it's going to maybe be like, I don't know, 5%. But it's a really fine-tune adjustments as we go farther down the line. So let's go to the saturation. Now there's lots of different ways to do it. I'm going to show you a couple different ways. in this course. The first one I'm going to show you is actually counterintuitive. You'd think you'd actually use the vector scope for this, for matching up the saturation, but I'm actually using the waveform because we've got this solid background and it goes across the entire image, and it's really easy to see what's going on. So if I bring this up, you can see that this blue line right here is higher than this blue line right here, and that's our background. You can see this line that's going across, it has kind of a red and green component. That's also the background as well. That area is pretty much going to stay anchored, and when we increase the saturation, we're going to be pulling that blue up, basically. And once we get the background match, it's going to match the skin tones really well as well. So let's go ahead and increase the saturation. If you go down here, you see there's a kind of comes up with a slider adjustment. You actually don't have to type a number. You can just click and then start dragging with your mouse. And you can see as I'm pulling it up, see how I'm pulling this up? Obviously that's too far, that's not enough. And I'm just basically by eye trying to line up that blue line. You can also see that the skin tones, the red component of the skin tones is being pulled up, and the green component of the skin tones is basically staying put. So I'm gonna say it's gonna wanna live right about here. So what is that? It's a 56.4. So let's move this out of the way. Like I said, this is about probably 10% of our grade. Let's turn it on and off. There's saturation off, saturation on, saturation off, saturation on. And as you can see, now we're getting really, really close. All right, moving on from saturation, we're moving on to our last node called color, and that's where we're gonna be lining up the different colors on the vector scope. So we're gonna move to the hue versus hue control. I'm just gonna click on all these different colors on the bottom. It's gonna accurately give me control points across here. And I'm gonna do the same thing on the hue versus sat. All right, so hue versus sat basically will line things up in terms of their saturation, how big they are. So I'm gonna match the two up. I'm just using my fingers as the dots that you might see. And then the hue versus hue will change the rotation of the angles to match up the dots on the chart. So let's do the hue versus sat first, because that usually has the most difference and we're doing the most work. So I'm gonna make this 2x zoom. And these things, the graph that you see here, you see the thing that says gradical. See these boxes? These are called these gradical boxes. And what we're trying to do is mostly these colors will line up into these boxes, but we don't want them to be in the boxes. We want to match the Sony to the Canon dots. We don't really care if it's in the box or if it's not in the box. We're just trying to match two different cameras. We're not trying to be technically correct. We're just trying to get the two to match. So I'm going to create a 2x zoom so I can see this better. And I'm going to start with yellow. And I'm just going to bring this up and down until I see the two dots are matching up in terms of saturation. There's green, there's cyan, there's blue, and magenta. Red, I'm going to skip for now. We'll come back to it later. Then hue versus hue. Now this is where we're going to actually line them up this way. So we're going to start with yellow and move it that way. It looks pretty good. Green actually looks really good. Cyan. Now there's a hue rotate down here at the bottom. You can see where I'm rotating this control. We could do it really accurately because trying to do it with the mouse, moving that up and down just a little bit, it can be kind of hard. So I'm just going to line those two up. I'll move on to blue. And those are pretty close. And magenta. That was pretty close as well. So if I turn on and off this node, the vector scope, you can definitely notice some differences going on there. If I move it out of the way and you look at her skin, we're not going to see much differences at all because we didn't make really any differences in the red channel. So what we're going to do next is we're going to isolate the skin. So let's go ahead to our edit sizing, and I'm just going to go ahead and zero in. I don't want her eyes because the color of eyes, mascara, all that stuff, I don't want that. And I don't want her lipstick. I just basically want this kind of area. It's very representative of all the different skin tones. I mean, there's more skin tones, but let's go ahead and isolate it. All right, now that we got the skin isolated, I'm gonna bring our scopes over here and we're gonna take a look at the differences between the two. I'm gonna turn off the Sony. And I want you to notice right here, and actually let's go ahead and zoom in on this. This is our basically the skin. And this right here, you see this line, this white line coming down? It's called the, I believe, the eye line, the skin tone line. And basically the thought process is if your skin pretty much is on that line, you're good to go. What you're seeing, some of this lines coming down, those are her nostrils, probably going to black. So there's this path to black, what we've got here. But mostly our skin on the Canon is right here. So let's go ahead and turn the Sony on. And what you can notice is what happens is that blob has gotten bigger. It's somewhat in the same area, but it's gotten thicker. And what happens as you go along a vector scope like this, basically as the vector gets bigger, like that blob, that basically means there's more variations of color. Now that we have our skin isolated, I want to take a timeout. Just look at some other skin examples, some high-end TV commercials really quick to kind of get a reference of where maybe the skin should be on the vector scope and how it compares to the Canon and the Sony. So let's go to our first example. This is from a Pantene TV ad, Sarah James. Great behind the scenes, by the way. I'll put a link to it down below. Matt Workman talks about all the different things of how they built the entire set in the soundstage, and how they talk about the colorist and everything that they've done in this TV commercial is, you know, they spend a lot of money on it, a lot of time getting the colors just right. And they hire the best colorist to make sure that the skin is just right. So let's take a look at what we've got here. So if we look at, we just isolate her nose basically, and along her cheek, we could see that skin tone line that she has there. The blob of color is to the right of the skin tone line. So it's not sitting on the skin tone line. All right, here's another one from a Pantene ad. And you can see that her skin on the vector scope is even farther away from the skin tone line, which is kind of interesting. This one, just from I think a flower ad on the Super Bowl, her skin is actually slightly touching the skin tone line, but it's mostly on the right-hand side. And about the only one I could find in terms of this Pantene ad, Selena Gomez, her skin is pretty much on the skin tone line. What do they have in common? The first thing that they all have in common is the way the skin goes off to the vector, it's very thin. That means that there's not a lot of variations in color. The thicker that blob gets on the vector line, basically that means there's more variation in color. Now let's take a look at the Canon 80D. The skin looks pretty good, but you're gonna see that the blob looks pretty large. It's thick, but it's, for the most part, it's on the right-hand side of the skin tone line. So why is that blob bigger? Basically, there's two reasons. One, comparing my skin against these actresses and models, I probably don't have the best skin. Second is that I don't wear makeup. And I would think I've never done makeup, but the professional makeup artists that they have on set, I'm sure basically limit the amount of variation in color. Like for instance, my nose usually shifts more towards red or magenta. And then like around my cheeks, usually shifts more towards like yellow. Let's take a look at that. So here's my cheek, and you can see it's more towards the skin tone line. But if you look at my nose, just isolate my nose, it's going more towards red. Now, if you compare me to a model, obviously my skin looks totally different. Again, I'm not wearing a makeup and I'm not as, as gorgeous as she is. So what about the Sony cameras? We've talked about Canon and some of these TV commercials, but what about Sony? So if we take a look at here, this is not graded, but it is custom white balanced, and I've white balanced it in post like we've done in the previous steps. But you'll notice there's kind of a green cast going on there with my skin. It's like greenish yellow kind of cast to it. Doesn't look right. But we can rotate my skin. So basically, I'm going to teach you how to do this here in a second. But basically what you see here, the difference is before on the left, you can see it's kind of down on the left side of the eye line, where after I've kind of shifted it and I've actually made it a little bit thinner. So here is not graded. Here is graded. Not graded, graded, before, after, And basically, I'm not changing the white balance at all. All that white, the gray, and the black patches are all exactly the same. The only thing I'm changing is the skin tones. To me, that looks a lot better graded. The skin is more shifted to the right, and that basically that blob has gotten thinner. So the question you might be asking yourself is, I've had these Sony cameras for a while. I not only shoot video with them, but I shoot stills with, but I'm not seeing that kind of greenish cast in my pictures. Why? The Canon 80D is on the left and the Sony a6500 on the right. They both look really, really similar. And this is basically, both of them are done in Lightroom using the Lightroom Adobe Standard profile. Not the camera style that it comes with, because when you shoot a raw image, Adobe basically puts their own spin or profile on it, and they both look really, really similar. I mean, the colors, everything line up almost identically. So however Adobe makes it, when they get the camera in, they must go through a whole bunch of testing when they create the profile, and every camera looks very similar to the other. But when we take a look at the JPEG, so I shot both JPEG and RAW at the same time. Now when we look at the difference, the Canon 80D has a very distinct look to it. It's that very Canon color look to it. Whereas the Sony on the right-hand side, you can see it kind of goes a little bit yellow. Whereas the Canon's JPEG processing, which is very similar to video, how they process, going through the same processing type of, I guess, algorithm in the camera as it gets processed to be made into video, has a very, like I said, just has that kind of Canon look to it. And also, you'll notice that the Sony kind of adds more, especially the JPEG, gives your skin a bit more blemishes. I guess you could say the blemishes and everything that you have on your skin kind of stand out a bit more on the Sony. All right, going back to our color match. And obviously with these, the blobs are overlaying each other. So what I do is turn off the Sony. So you can see the Canon, again, has a very thin kind of look to it. All right, now I've just got the Sony, and this is the Sony blob color right here. And you can see I'm turning on and off the Canon, and now I'm turning on and off the Sony. So we gotta get the blob basically thinner. So let's go ahead, and we've got both of them turned on right now. Make sure that we're on the Sony. And I'm gonna put a number of control points in. I'm gonna put one about here. I'm gonna show where each one of these is located here in a second. About right here, and then one kind of about here. Space these out a little bit more. So both of them are turned on. And again, I'm gonna show you, actually, I'm gonna show you these two. These are the only two I can really show you at this point. If I take this control point and I bring it up, you see her nose is turning more magenta, and her nose is turning more green. And if we go to the other one, this one right here, it's pretty much everything else on our skin. So if we look at the vector scope, let me bring it down here. And if I start shifting this around, you can see what's happening to the blob, the Sony blob, as it overlays on the Canon blob. And what I'm trying to do is get it to where I think maybe right there. And what I'm trying to do is, and I'm going to take this other blob and kind of go the other direction, and see how it just got thinner right there? Maybe about right there. Now, if I turn the color on and off, you can see how the blob is getting thinner, and it's matching more of what the Canon is. So basically what we've done is we've just taken that blob and made it a little bit thinner. All right, so let's go ahead and relax the two so we can see what we've done. Here's off, here's on, here's off, here's on, here's off, here's on. It's very hard to see. There's very minor differences, but when you add up all of these little tiny differences or changes that I'm doing together, ultimately it gets them very, very close. So you might be asking, well, why not use these skin tone patches that are on the chart, isolate them like we did before, and match those up? I've tried doing that, but I found the method of just isolating that part of her face is a lot more effective. So what I want to do is go through all these control points and show you basically what they do. This first one, which I pretty much have not changed, I'm going to increase it, and you can see her lips turn magenta or they turn green. magenta, green. So that's really the only thing it's really affecting in this image is just her lipstick color. So I'm gonna pretty much put this back to where it was before by double clicking it. The second one in, which is on this, each vector has its own angle. So if you're just curious where this is, this next point is at 265. You can see down here, 265.22. We're at negative 2.9 basically. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna increase this so you can see what's going on, or decrease it, you can see the green. This is more obvious. So you can see like her around her nose, the highlights on her forehead, her chin, her ears, and even down on her neck, there's some places. So if I put that back to where it was, minus 2.88, let's take this one, which is at a 0.58, or basically a 0.6 that I've moved it to. Let's move it around. You can see mostly that's the rest of her skin. It's either magenta or green. So let's go ahead and put that back to where it was. And then this one, actually let's zero this one out because I did not make any changes with this one. I'm just gonna bring this one up, bring this one down, and you can see that there are some differences down on her neck. And we are done with our color match number one. As you can see, they look almost identical, or if not identical. If I didn't tell you that they weren't shot from the same camera, you might not know. So what I thought would be really cool is, since we did this in a very scientific kind of way, could we put a number on this? Could we scientifically show how well I did? And so what I did here is I took both images and I lined them up basically. So they were perfectly aligned, and so her eyes were perfectly aligned, and everything about her skin was in the right spot. Because if it wasn't in the right spot, this wouldn't have worked. And then what I did is I exported the images out to my desktop, and then I opened a program called 3D LUT Creator. And then within 3D LUT Creator, I opened the Canon file first, created a grid around her face, basically, including her lips, and then some of the background as well. I wasn't so much concerned about the chart. I was mostly concerned, because what do you do when you're done with the chart? You take it out of the frame. I was mostly interested in the color match of her skin, her lips, and the background. And then what I did is I brought in the Sony camera, and then I loaded those same points on there, and this program gives you a comparison between the 2 points. So if there's a point on her forehead, that point will both have the Canon value as well as the Sony value. And then what we're looking for is the delta E. And as you can see in this number that's called average delta E 76, as you can see, it's below 2. And that's pretty darn good. If you ever went shopping for a monitor, you've always looked for a monitor that could do a delta E of less than 2. And this is some verbiage that was from a ViewSonic page explaining what delta E was, but I thought it was pretty interesting for this. And basically what it said was, up here, delta E is used to ensure the color being displayed is reproduced with the color hue that matches so closely to the color input that the human eye can't perceive the difference, a delta E of less than 2. It goes on to say that if you have a delta E of less than 1 between two colors that are not touching, it is barely perceivable by an average human observer. Delta E of 3 to 6 is usually considered an acceptable number in commercial reproductions. So a delta E of less than 2, I think we're doing pretty good. All right, we're on to color match number 2. This time we're going to be using Cine 1 for our picture profile in the Sony a7R II. Match number 1, I chose a very simple background, super simple. I wanted to keep it easy so we could concentrate just on the skin. What I do here is actually this particular shot. Got lots of color going on behind me. You got some magenta here, some blue, you got my picture right there. It's got a lot of different colors that will definitely help with this color match. So we're kind of getting more complex, especially since we're also using Cine 1, which kind of has some weird contrast, especially in the skin tones. So let's go ahead and look at what we got. So we got the Canon's gonna be always on the left, Sony's on the right, and as you can see from here, just from the white patch that you can see right here and right here, the exposure is pretty similar. Although when you look at my face, it looks kind of dark, especially compared to the Canon. But in terms of the white patches, they're very similar. So what I'm gonna do is I've already created 6 different nodes basically, and that's going to follow through our workflow. So it'll be a lot easier to just keep track. First step is levels, and like I've done before, what I'm going to do is isolate the chart, and then we can make sure that my skin and the gray in the chart is up to where it is with the Canon. All right, now as you can see, we've got the Canon is up around, I don't know, 55, and we've got our gray patch on the Sony Cine 1 down around 40. So let's make just like we did before, just gonna make a simple move right in the middle. Just kind of bring that up, and maybe we'll just bring down the highlights just a little bit like this. So now when we do our white balance, it'll be a lot easier. Going on to step number 2 is verses. Now what we can do here, so what I've done here is I've created a power grade album right here from our last color match. And I'm just going to take this particular one, and all it is just the verses node from the previous one, and slap it on here. And when we go to Lume versus Sat and Sat versus Sat, we don't have to do anything. It's already done. So we can kind of keep moving, which is great. We're going to go on to step number 3, which is white balance. Let's move this up here so we can see this better. So right here, the Canon is all white balance. I've already done it already. And the Sony, you can see we've got kind of the blue level on the highlights is down slightly. Now, the verses node and the white balance node are right next to each other versus before. And basically what the verses is doing is getting rid of some of that saturation in the highlights and in the shadows. So what I'm going to do, just to demonstrate this, is I'm going to actually disable the node verses, and I'm going to do the white balance first. And then we're going to enable it and see what happens. So I'm going to see we've got kind of a blue, I don't know what it's called, an under push. So we need to push the blue up, and maybe like that. And down here on the blacks, I always go to the blacks next. It looks like the red needs to come up a little bit. What I'm going to do is hit play. Just go through a few frames. And sure enough, it looks like that the red channel is down slightly. So I'm just going to take the red and push it up ever so slightly. And since I did that, now the midtones have kind of a red push. So now I'm going to take the midtones and I'm going to pull that down. Now you might be thinking, Dave, this is like really nitpicky stuff. You're hardly moving the mouse at all. I can't even see anything registering on the lift gain gain controls. I mean, you might be moving it like a pixel. I can't even see that it's moved. And it's very true. But I will tell you, to just get this as close as you can in the beginning, because this, again, is your foundation. And a lot of times, like I said before, if later on, as things aren't matching up, it's probably a white balance issue. So now what I'm going to do is release or enable the verses node. And you can see what happened. Well, here's enabled, disabled, enabled, disabled. And basically, it's just cleaning things up just a little bit. In fact, now that I've enabled it, I think there maybe is too much blue up high. I'm actually going to pull that down slightly. Again, these are really super minor changes. Here I'm going to disable. And now you can see that we've got kind of an under push, blue. I don't even know what the correct term is. So I'm going to actually do this with the disabled, just so we can get it as accurate as we can. And then let's go ahead and enable it. And then it cleans it up. So you can see how, again, the Sony cameras have just too much saturation in the highlights and the shadows. And this just helps clean that kind of stuff up. Now, really where it comes into play is a lot of times when you're matching up skin tones and stuff like that, you'll get a dark area, or like when I had my hat on before, you'll have a very dark area. And in that darkness, there'll be too much saturation on the Sony cameras. And that verses node just cleans that up. All right, now let's go ahead and relax the bottom of the charts. Let's go ahead and slide this over here so I can see what we're doing. Go to the Sony. We're on the contrast node. And let's go ahead and start playing with it to see where we're at. Bring up the middle. Go halfway down. All right, and then we'll move on to the saturation node. and we will relax the chart. Then we'll go to saturation node. Right about there. All right, looking at these two images, it looks like we're getting pretty close. Things I can see right off the bat, the saturation on the face looks pretty close, but we have this blue background right here looks a lot bluer than over here. So I'm gonna kind of address that first. We're gonna go back to U versus Sat. I'm gonna go ahead and just use my eyedropper tool and click right on it. You can see it's not in a location where the other one was. The blue is over here, whereas it selected this one. I'm actually gonna get rid of this kind of control node. And what I'm gonna do is just basically pull this down. And let's bring the vector scope over so we can kind of see what's happening here. You can see that blob. I'm actually gonna pull the whole blue channel down. You can see where the blob is kind of going like that. And I'm trying to match up where it is with the other one. Now I'm gonna go to the vector waveform. And you can see the blue blob right, this blue area right here and the blue area right here. Let's go ahead and see how I'm moving it and see how this one is right about here. And I'm just gonna try to bring this down. I'm gonna bring this down along with it to about maybe right here. So now the backgrounds are looking pretty good. And now we're gonna look at the color of this right here. So I'm gonna move this back over here. And I'm just gonna select right here, and it shows pretty much right on yellow. I'm gonna get rid of this control point right here, but I'm just gonna move this around, and I can see that this, you can see where I'm moving the painting up and down, not the painting, but the picture. It's very close to what we have over on this side. Maybe go up just a slight bit, maybe about right there. So now when we take a look at the two, we're looking pretty close. And we zoom in. One of the things I'm noticing right off the bat is like right here in my cheeks, looking a little bit green compared to the Canon over here. Looks just a little bit like there's a little bit of a green cast right here. So what we're gonna do is go ahead and isolate the skin like we did before. All right, now that we've got both of them isolated, let's take a look at what we got on the waveform first. They seem to be peaking out. The red channel about the same, green channel looks to be peaking out about the same, and the blue channel may be a little bit different right here. And then like you see these lines that go down here, those are my, well, it's not so much my nostrils, but the shadow created from my nose right here. So let's go to the vector scope. And what I'm gonna do is turn off the Sony. So that's the Canon, and that's a Sony. Canon, Sony. So just like last time, we've got that vector that's coming off that angle. It's that blob is a bit wider, so there's more variations in color, which is probably the red in my nose and probably maybe a little yellow or green over in my cheeks. So like we did before, let's go ahead. I'm just gonna zoom in here like this, and we'll slide this over here. And then we'll go to our hue versus hue. And we're gonna create those same type of control dots. One about here, one about here, and one about here. I'm just gonna go ahead and, since I don't know how to add these without making them create a value, make sure that they're all zeroed out. And actually I'm gonna spread this just a little bit. Basically these two dots that you see right here, basically I'm trying to shift them. So one dot's going down and one dot is coming up, and that's what creates that thinning of the vector of that blob on the vector scope, the skin or whatever you want to call it. So let's start off with this one right here, and we'll just start playing with it. We'll go down, and you can see it's getting thinner, maybe to about right here. As I go down, you can see my nose is turning green. As I go to high, it turns magenta. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm getting rid of some of my red nose. Again, I don't wearing any makeup or anything. So we're just gonna bring this down a little bit. And then this one, obviously don't wanna go down because it's gonna go below that eye line. And remember when we talked about those models and the TV commercials, usually for the most part, they're usually on the other side of that line, the right side of the line. So we're going to go the other direction. And you can see how it's getting thinner. We're trying to line those two up. And I'm also looking at the image right here. Now my monitor is calibrated. I just calibrated it just a few days ago. So not only am I doing this scientifically with the vector scope, I'm looking at the image too, just to see if I'm getting rid of some of that green and yellow along my cheek. And then in this node right here, we'll see if this does anything. Typically, if I bring it, it usually wants to go up. And sure enough, you can see as I pull it up, it's pulling some of that stuff away from the eye line. So if I go too far, you can see my cheeks are starting to turn. But I'd say maybe right about here or so. Now if we turn on and off the Sony, you can see that we're very close now, but on the vector. So let's go ahead and relax the crops. And now we're definitely getting pretty darn close. The color of the background looks good. This looks pretty good. In fact, while we got the vector scope open, I want to take a look at the saturation of the red, or sorry, this picture back here. And you can see this big blob right here. I'm just going to click on the picture where I think maybe most representative. And you can see it put a dot right here. I'm actually going to get rid of this one. And I'm just going to bring this up and down to see what happens. And see, it was maybe a bit higher. It was a bit hotter than the other one. So I can bring it down and bring it up. I'm just trying to match it what the Canon is. So maybe about right there. But that's also going to affect our skin tones. So let's take a look at our skin here. And just look to see, because we're not cropped in right now, but they look pretty close. What I'm going to do is take another point, because we know this is part of the skin, and bring this up. I'll just let go of this. It's too far. It's not enough. And I'm going to look over here. Again, we want to try to do this as scientifically as we can. And you can see that blob. I'm looking right here. But again, since these are overlaid, it's kind of tough to tell. So I'm going to go to the waveform. And I'm just going to bring this up and down. And you can see how this highlight and the red, which is probably right here where my forehead is, and this one right here, just basically bringing this up and down to see where they match. Say about right there. Okay, I think we're pretty much done. Let's go ahead and review it and see what we've got here. Again, I think the background, this kind of purplish blue, looks pretty good. I'm going to say that these look pretty close. The skin tones look pretty good. Let's zoom in. I'm going to say, like right here, you see that part of my cheek right here as it starts to go to shadow is a little bit green on the Canon, and whereas I do not see that over here. So I might have gone a little bit too far. I'm just going to, this time I'm going to pick that point. We know that this is usually the nose and this is usually the cheek. And what I'm going to do is bring it, as I bring it down, it goes to green. As I go up, it goes to magenta. So I'm just going to bring it down. It's right now, it's around 5.5. And I'm just going to bring this down. In fact, I'll go too far. So you can see how my face is turning green. I don't want to go that far. I was up 5 before, so maybe I want to be right about here, around 2 or 3. Because sometimes when you have on the vectors, when you're on the vector scope and I have the two blobs overlaying each other, you can't see both of them exactly how they're positioned. So we're just basically fine tuning it right now. This one's at a -4, which means I've pulled my nose, the very reddest part around my nose, I've pulled it more towards green instead of having it be too magenta. It's at -4. If I relax that a little bit, let's see what happens. No, I think it wants to be at around a -4. When we compare it to this one, they both look good. I'd say the saturation looks pretty good, and a little bit of that green, and there's, maybe we're gonna take this one and go, instead of big 3, maybe we'll bring this down around 2. And then this one, which is at 8, we'll bring this one down. And actually, now that I've done that, I think it was actually this one that was causing that the green. Yeah. So I'm just going to bring this one down a bit more, bring it down to about a 3. So that's pretty much it for color match number 2. One piece of advice I'd give you, like I'm doing in this image, is I'm holding this up to my chin. And I would advise you guys to do this after. Don't do it at the very beginning, because it always seems like when I do an interview and at the very beginning, and then I'll adjust a light, and then I'll adjust something, and then maybe I'll change the camera setting like a third of a stop here. And it always seems to happen. But if you do it at the end and you've made all those changes, and make sure you have the talent still seated, and just give them the chart and have them put it under their chin. I mean, you could put it in front of their face like this, but then you're going to lose skin. If you put it off, even if you put it off just a little bit, you might not be in the same type of light, because it can move drastically. Like as I move here, you can see I'm going into shadow because I've got a gobo right there. So, and then just hold it, and then just make sure you don't have any errors. And then remember, don't hold it tilted like this, because when you go to crop, it's just going to be a lot harder to crop in on it. All right, next up we are going to match the Sony S-Log footage to the Canon Standard with the contrast turned all the way down. And we look at them, you can see obviously the S-Log footage is a lot flatter than the Canon footage. So we're gonna have to really have some work to do here. She's both addressing the camera pretty much straight on. In the last color match we're gonna actually have an angled, actual one kind of straight on, one off to the side, more of like what you typically do in an interview. I know I'm going to do these straight on just because it makes it so much easier to evaluate the image after we're done. S-Log has a lot of different color modes you can choose from. Like, I think it actually defaults to like S-Gamut, which increases the color gamut. What I've found is it's really hard to wrangle those colors back into something that looks like the Canon. So I actually use either still or movie are the 2 color modes that most represent what the Canon colors look like. So in this case, I'm actually using the still color mode within the S-Log 2 picture profile. Now, before we even start, I'm going to cover this more later on, but there's something that we have to pay attention to if you create a LUT within Resolve and then go to Premiere Pro. If you don't, and you stay within all within Resolve, so you do your editing and your color grading all within Resolve, this doesn't matter as much, but let me just show you what's going on here. If we go to the Edit tab, and we go to S-Log 2 footage right here, if you go up to Clip Attributes, there's Auto, what it defaults to. There's Video, which is more like a 16 to 235, I believe, data range, which is it's called Limited. So if this is the full, think of this as the full video signal. It actually limits it. It brings it down slightly. And the last one is full, where it's like 0 to 255. So the video, which is also called limited, kind of goes a little bit inward in terms of its video signal. So how do we know which one to select? Resolve actually gets this wrong. All the other ones that we've been doing, like the standard creative style within the Sony cameras, leaving it on auto works great. But so how do you know? How do you know what to do? So basically what you can do is go to Find in Media Pool. And then if you click on Find in Media Pool, you can go to say Open File Location. And there's a program that I use that's called Media Info. And again, I'm going to cover this more in depth later. And then I just go down to HTML. And down here under Video, there's a thing that's called Color Range. And you actually see it says Full. And so what we're going to do is go back into Resolve, set this to full under Clip Attributes. Again, I'm going to cover this more in detail later. Now watch what happens. Here, I'm going to slide this over here. Watch what happens to this footage right here when I click OK. Here we go, right now. You see how it got flatter? So it wasn't interpreting, or I think interpret's the correct word, wasn't interpreting the data levels correctly. This is very important, like I said, if you go a round trip from Resolve into Premiere Pro or probably Final Cut, Edius, wherever you're going. Again, it doesn't matter so much if you're staying all within Resolve. As you can see on the Canon, you can see the video signal looks very normal. And you look at the S-Log footage, it looks very flat here. And as you can see here, it looks very squashed basically. So let's get started. All right, first up is levels. And I'm just gonna bring up the whites to match, bring down the blacks to match, as close as I can. And the midtones, what I'm gonna try to do is make this as linear as possible so I don't have to make an adjustment in the middle. And again, this step doesn't have to be super close, but I'll pull this down ever so slightly. So that's our levels. Versus node, we've already done. So I'm gonna move on to the white balance. And as you can see, it looks pretty close. We definitely have some stuff going on the shadows. So I'm actually gonna start in the shadows first. You can look at the red looks a bit low. So I'm just gonna pull the opposite way of red, or actually towards red. And then you can see there's a little bit of too much red on the highlights. And gosh, the midtones look really good. I'm gonna go ahead and play around with it a little bit, see if I can pull a little bit of that out of there. And that's white balance. All right, moving on to contrast. S-Log, again, is going to be a little bit different than what we've done before, but the principles are the same. All right, next up, we'll move on to saturation. There we go. Looks like we added about, is that 52.6, where I matched these up right here. Move on to the color node. So as you can see after I'm done here, there's not much changes that we made, mostly in the blue area for the way the colors line up. So the still color mode is pretty accurate. But what you will notice is the saturation is a bit different than what we've done before. We've never seen yellow this high before. All right, next up, we're gonna isolate her face. Okay, the two are overlaid right now. So that is the Canon, very, very thin, and that is the Sony. So we've got a little bit of work to do. All right, let's take a look at saturation next. All right, here are the two overlaid. There's just the Canon and there's the Sony. So as you notice, I went through that one pretty quick. I fast forwarded through a lot of the different sections. I wanted to kind of show you the pacing of it, which I think is important for you to understand, because like the first one we did, it seemed like it just took forever. I actually practice these before I do it on camera. And when I did this one with S-Log, I was like, you know what, let's see how long it takes. And it took me 8 minutes to do, which is about right. I can do it in about 8 minutes. Sometimes it'll be a little bit more challenging, like the background I might have to play with that. Might add an extra minute or two to get that in there. But this one only took 8 minutes to do, and this was S-Log, which is great. I mean, if you look at the before and after, we've come a long way from before to after. So there are other methods to do this, color matching, which you might have tried, maybe you haven't. Resolve has a color match feature that actually uses the X-Rite chart. You can actually put the chart up, draw a box around it, match it. Then you could do that to the other camera, match it, and then see if both cameras match. Yeah, it doesn't, especially in the reds, that method doesn't work that well. Sometimes it works perfectly, but I'd say the success rate is way less than 50%. Now, in order to do that whole methodology I just talked about, like you match up one camera using a chart, match up the other camera using a chart within Resolve, and then you see if they both match. That could take anywhere from 4 to 6 minutes to do it that way. So you might as well spend the extra 2 minutes, do it the work method I did this way, and your success rate is really high. I mean, we're getting really, really close here using my workflow. There's other programs like SpeedGrade have a color match feature, and there's another program called 3D LUT Creator. It has a kind of a one-click solution where you bring in a reference image, you put the thing around the chart, and then you bring in the other image, and then you click match, and then sometimes it works perfectly. But I would say that one has a success rate of around 50%. And that costs time as well. If you bring it into 3D LUT Creator and do all that, that could take, 6 to 8 minutes doing it that way. I've never timed it, but I'm just gonna guess. So my method, the workflow that I do, is probably the longest method of doing it, 8 minutes. But the success rate, as you can see, works really, really well if you follow this workflow. All right, next up, we're gonna do an actual interview with 2 different camera angles. I'm gonna go ahead and play the interview for you. I've already done the match between the 2 cameras. I'm not gonna tell you what camera's which if you wanna try to guess, and we'll come back and then I'll show you them unmatched.
So now I was just looking that I might need to get one of these machines that have PCI Express switches in them. So you may not know it, but sometimes, like if your processor doesn't have enough PCI Express ports on it, they can put a switch in, and then the switch can communicate with PCI Express cores.
Now I'm gonna play without them being matched. This is the A7R2 right here, and this is the Canon T2i from like, I don't know, many years ago. So this is the A7R2, and this is the T2i that we're gonna match to. And as you can see, the skin tones are quite a bit different. What I want to do is play you the part where I'm actually directing the talent on where to hold the chart after the interview. And what I want you to notice is, because we have 2 different camera angles, and we have a key light and a fill light, when he moves it around, you're going to see the black area is going to have errors on one camera, but not the other. So go, and you'll actually hear me. Go ahead and listen to it. I think what you got it now is perfect, but yeah, I can see a little. Rotate it just like, yeah, now go the other direction. Slightly. Now go back to right where you are. So as you can tell, when he's moving it around, one will have errors and the other one won't. All right, let me give you a tip. This will save you a bit of time. It's gonna take you a few extra seconds to do while you're at the shoot. When you have the talent at the end of your interview, hold up the chart like this, and you've got 2 different angles, one here and like one like there. Help yourself out. If you're just starting this and you don't want to worry about errors, like one chart having errors and the other chart not having errors on 2 different cameras, is to take your 8 camera off after you shot the chart, and then take your B camera, put it right where your 8 camera was, and so they're both straight or mostly on axis to the camera, kind of thing like this. And then have them move it, towards your key light, have them move it towards the camera, move it up, move it down, make sure you don't have any black issues on the black part in terms of errors. And that will help a lot. So if we look here, you can see that obviously one zoomed in versus the other. This is the Sony on the right, the Canon on the left. But you can see the black on both of them look really good. All right, let's get started. So we'll start with levels, and let's isolate the chart as usual. So we're gonna have to bring this down to about here, and we'll bring this up to about right here. And we'll probably have to bring this down maybe about right there. All right, versus node I've already done. In fact, we'll go ahead and cancel that out before we do any white balance. And let's go ahead and do the white balance. Start on the top maybe. In fact, you know what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take the temperature slider, since everything looks kind of warm. I'm just gonna cool it down like this. And we'll go back to lift gamma gain. Starting in the highlights. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna start in the shadows down here with like a red push. So I'm gonna pull that down like that. Highlights, maybe bluish. So I'm gonna go to red. Nope. Oh, right about there. Sometimes it's hard to describe which direction I'm going. And then here, it looks like there's a green under push. So I'm gonna go towards green. And now we've got some green showing up here. So I'm gonna go away from green on the shadows. And maybe a little bit of magenta. So pull towards green slightly again. And this looks like more green, away from green. Maybe a little bit again in the midtones. I'd call that pretty good. So let's put the versus node back on. And as you can see, the highlights are a little bit off. So I'm just gonna play with the highlights a little bit now that we've turned the versus node on. All right, next up is contrast. All right, next up we'll go to saturation. Global saturation. Again, we're kind of looking in this area right here. Trying to match up these dots right in here. Looks like we're around 44. And next we're going on to color. All right, next up we're going to isolate his face. And just for kicks, this time I'm gonna leave his eyes in. His eyes don't have that much color in them. And let's see, we're gonna get a little bit more skin in the frame. Maybe even a little bit of his hair, because his hair seems very black, void of any color. So we'll give this a test and see how well it does. All right, here is the Canon and here's the Sony. And you can see we got some work to do. All right, that's pretty much it. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we got. Go full screen. And I gotta say that looks really, really good. If you look around here on the Canon, you kind of see, I probably should have taken this out when I graded this image before as a reference, but you can kind of see there's some magenta, especially around his eyes and around his eyebrow right here, a little bit right here. But as you can see, I'm seeing the same thing over here, so that matched really well. You can kind of see this around his temple, kind of goes a little bit to yellow a little bit, and I'm seeing the same thing over here. All right, I'm shooting on both cameras at the same time. The cameras are set to standard picture style, contrast turned down. Might be looking at the Canon face thinking it's a little on the bright side, where you might be looking at my skin in terms of the Sony, and the exposure might look about right. Now I haven't done any post-processing or anything. So I thought I'd talk about the white, the gray, and the black in terms of setting it up. And then what I do, obviously you guys can do things differently, however you like to do it. The gray patch here on the box from X-Rite says it's supposed to be 40 IRE. I'm like, 40 IRE? Where'd you guys get that from? So I called them up. I'm like, what camera did you use and what picture profile did you use to come up with the 40 IRE number? And they said, well, we used a variety of different cameras, but they didn't say if they were like shot in S-Log or they were shot in with Canon or ARRI Alexa or Red Epic or anything like that. They just said a variety of different cameras. So I wouldn't use 40, no. In terms of exposing. I mean, you can expose any way you like, but I'm going to kind of show you what I do. So what we've got here, the black levels for both cameras are pretty much identical. The gray for the Canon is coming in around 57, and the Sony, the gray patch, is coming in around 50. The white patches are quite different. Even though the Canon face might look really bright, you might be thinking the white patch is brighter than the Sony. Well, it's not. It's actually the opposite. The Sony white patch is coming in around, I'd say 99, pretty hot. Whereas the Canon patch is coming around 90 IRE, 92 maybe. So about a 10 IRE difference on the white patch. Even though the Canon face looks brighter, the white patch is actually lower on the Canon, which is kind of odd. So let's say that you set up a typical interview. I just want to talk, I know we've kind of talked about this before a little bit, but I want to re-emphasize. You don't want to get any errors in the blacks on that black part. So if I push this forward, you're probably starting to see I can see the black coming up, at least on the Sony. I don't know about the Canon, but you can see I'm getting errors right there as I'm pushing this around, and it's causing reflections basically. So I've just basically situated this where, I've got two lights that are pretty equal on my face right now. Now you can rotate it towards your key light, or you could rotate it to the camera. Really, I don't think it really makes any difference, like unless your key light is way off, like way behind you or something like that, then you might want to face it towards the camera. But basically what I'm looking for is a nice even shelf. So that white patch is it's not like doing this. It's nice and level. Same with the gray and the black. That's kind of what I look for. To me, it makes it a lot easier, because a lot of times what I find when it's rotated like this, there'll be certain colors, like when you're trying to white balance, that are different over here than they are down on the bottom side of it. So it just makes things a lot easier. So what I would do is just take it and keep rotating it around, or if somebody's holding it under the chin, just keep rotating or flipping it up, flipping it down. Make sure the blacks don't have any errors, and make sure the lines are as straight as you can get them. So knowing all this, how do you set up your cameras exposed? Well, what I typically do is I'll take that white patch for the Sony and I'll just bring it almost to 100. Whereas the Canon, the white patch will be around 90. But unfortunately, both of these cameras don't put, any sort of waveform monitors in them. So you can't see, you don't have, especially on the Canon, you don't even have zebras. The 5D Mark IV doesn't have zebras. Both of them don't have false color, and they don't have waveform monitors. So how do you know? So basically what I've done is I usually zoom in on the chart as far as I can without changing the aperture or anything like that. And then what I'll do is look for, on the histogram, you're going to see a little spike for the white patches of the black and the gray. So you want to basically see where those line up. And then I just take that white spike and I just try to bring it all the way over. I'll usually bring it down a third of a stop, just below clipping. And that's kind of why my face looks so bright on the Canon. And that's typically what I do. And again, I'm in a controlled lighting situation. I don't have like windows in the background that are being blown out or anything like that. If that was the case, I might be shooting an S-Log on the Sony camera, and I would be again shifting everything to the right, because the Sony camera works the best, at least I've found, in S-Log 2 or S-Log 3, when you kind of overexpose, or not so much overexpose, but you basically fill the histogram. All right, you've matched up your two cameras in Resolve, and you want to bring them into a program like Premiere Pro or Final Cut. What I'm going to be demonstrating here is Premiere Pro. I don't own a Macintosh. Maybe someday when I get one, I'll update this video to include that as well. But I would think the procedure should be very similar. And what I want to do is kind of help you avoid some common pitfalls that when you bring it into like Premiere Pro and it doesn't look right, I'll show you what to look for in order to correct it. So what we've got here is, I'm not matching two cameras. I just shot a chart and I just cropped in on it. And what I did here is I actually put the color vectors, each color, into their vector boxes or graticals. As you can see here, they're perfectly aligned. If I actually turn the grade off that I've done, you can see they're outside the boxes. I just matched them all up to make this really simplistic in terms of this demonstration. So what you want to do is right click on the clip that you've got here and go all the way down to where it says Generate 3D LUT Cube. And then for right now, I'm just going to do this on the desktop. I'm going to call this one A7R2 Standard, because I shot it in the Standard Picture Style. And I'm going to call this Auto. And I'll explain why I call it Auto later. And I'll just save it. What I'm going to do is go into Premiere Pro. And right here is the same A7R2 Standard. Right here and I'm in the Lumetri color tab, and I'm over here where it says basic correction. You have an input LUT, and I'm basically just going to browse for the one we just saved, which is on my desktop, which is called A7R2 Standard Auto, and I'm going to apply the LUT. Now we can look at our vector scope, and it's kind of difficult because these are saturation values for the colors are halved, and there's no way to basically multiply ×2 to get these to fit in their boxes. So what I've done is actually created a screen capture of this, and I went back into Resolve, and I'm going to turn on that particular screen capture. So what you have here on the right hand side is the original footage, and what you have here is the JPEG screen capture that I took from Premiere Pro and brought it in. And what I want to do is turn these two on and off and look at the vector scope of what happens when I turn it on and off. They look identical. There's no color shifts or anything. In fact, if we go to the waveform, I just want to demonstrate as I turn it on and off, you can see that these match up perfectly. Levels, color, saturation, everything looks great. All right, we're going to do the same thing that we just did, but we're going to do it for S-Log2. So here is after the grade. Here's before the grade, just to show you. And I'll just bring up the waveform real quick. Here's before, and here's after the grade. Just match things up, especially on the vector scope, so we can see how everything is working. What I did again is went ahead and created a 3D LUT, which I've already done using this method. Went into Premiere Pro. Here is our S-Log2 footage. And then what I'm going to do here is go down to Browse and pick the S-Log2 A7R2 S-Log2 Auto. Again, I'll talk about Auto here in a second. Apply the grade. We've got the vector scope and our waveform turned on here. And again, it's really difficult to see what's happening, but we can kind of see something's going on definitely in the highlights, shadows. You can see the highlights are definitely turning kind of magenta. So something didn't translate very well. So what I'm going to do is go back to Resolve and turn on the layer that we've already done. I did a screen capture. So on the right, this is the original footage, and on the left is the Premiere Pro exported frame JPEG. And as we can see on the vector scope, something's going on here. Magenta, you can see basically is down in saturation, is off a little bit. Same thing with blue. Pretty much across the board, saturation is lower. And the big difference that you'll notice is when we go to the waveform, something is definitely off here. All right, what's going on here? So standard works great. Take it from Resolve, go into Premiere, the LUT works perfect. We do the same thing with S-Log2, go from Resolve, create a LUT into Premiere Pro. It's not working. It's not, the colors aren't matching up, the levels aren't right. What's going on? So basically what it comes down to is data levels or video levels. Basically there is a full, like a 0 to 255 level. And there's also a limited, or what's also known as video, like a 16 to 235 level. What does that all mean? So let's go and take a look at what we got here. This is our standard footage. And if I right click on it, go up to clip attributes, you see there's data levels. There's auto, which it defaults to. There's video, which is our limited video signal, which goes from 16 to 235. And there's full, which goes from 0 to 255. With standard, we set it to auto, and that translation from Resolve to Premiere worked great. However, we look at the S-Log footage, go to clip attributes. This is also set to auto, and Resolve didn't get it right. If you're dealing with a ecosystem or a workflow that only involves just Resolve, you don't really have to pay attention to this too much. Obviously, you want to get it right, but even if you made a mistake, it wouldn't really matter. You do your grade, and you're living, you're editing, you're doing your color grading, everything in Resolve, so everything's good. The problem comes when you go from Resolve, create a LUT, go into Premiere Pro, then you're going to run into this issue. So before you even start grading, you want to make sure that your data levels are correct within Resolve first. So how do you know? How do you know the difference between what's limited or video and what's full? Let me show you. So what I do is use a program called Media Info. You can download it for free. It's mediaarea.net. I usually go to View, HTML, Video, Heading, go down usually towards the bottom, you'll find something called Color Range. And for this, which is done in standard creative style, you see it's set to limited. Now limited is the same thing as video. So if we go back into Resolve, we would set this to video. Now if we go to the S-Log footage, we do the same thing. View, HTML, Video. This one says color range is set to full. So go back into Resolve, I'd right click on the clip for S-Log, go to clip properties, and I would set this from auto to full. All right, just to recap, on the top here we got Sony. The standard creative style equals limited, or in the case of how Resolve writes it, video for your data levels. You want to select that. For S-Log2, picture profile is going to be full. So you're going to want to select that within Resolve before you start grading. On the Canon side of things, we have the 4K motion JPEG coming off the 5D Mark IV. That is equal to limited, or in case what you choose in Resolve is video. And then pretty much any Canon from like a T2i to a 5D Mark IV, pretty much what I have found, anytime you shoot 1080 MOV, you're like an all-eye Kodak, for instance, or I believe even IPB, you're going to want to set that to full. Because if you don't, the whites will be pretty much above 100 and the blacks will be crushed. But when you set it to full, all those will come into range properly. Now, I've done a lot of different tests on the Canon side of things, going from this workflow of going from Resolve, creating a LUT, bringing it into Premiere Pro, applying the LUT. On the 1080 Full HD, when your MOV wrapper, because you have choice of MOV or MP4 on the Canon cameras, the MOV gave the most accurate colors. It was pretty much exactly the same. There was no difference. Everything lined up perfectly. But with the MP4 wrapper, for some reason, using this workflow going from Resolve into Premiere Pro, when I applied the LUT, things were slightly off, just a little bit, maybe to the point where they might be noticeable. So in terms of using a wrapper within the Canon cameras, you might want to use MOV before you use MP4. So at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, I got to deal with data levels and their workflow, and this is so confusing. Why can't I just say in Premiere Pro? I love my Premiere Pro and I don't want to leave Premiere Pro. Can I do everything in Premiere Pro? Well, let me kind of show you a workflow that you might want to do. As you can see here is my S-Log2 footage. And what I've done here is, you can create a curve just like we did to match up the two cameras. You can also do like hue versus saturation right here. You can see I bumped out kind of the yellowish green area right there to match. And you've got three-way color corrector, so you can definitely do white balance. But the thing you really can't do here is like the hue versus hue control. Remember we were talking about the vector of skin and then decreasing it, making it smaller to match up with the Canon. If we go to Resolve, what I could do is I could turn off the saturation, the contrast, the white balance, the levels. I could leave the versus, so we have our sat versus sat and our lume versus sat. And I could also keep the color tab that has our hue versus hue, and you could also keep in the hue versus sat. What I could do is right click, generate a 3D LUT, and then bring that into Premiere Pro, and that will work generically most of the time. So you could just generically apply that across the board. Is it going to give you the type of match that you're going to get in Resolve? Pretty close. And like I said, most of the time, if you get your white balance nailed in camera, like you did a custom white balance, 80% of the stuff you're going to do is with contrast. You want to spend most of your time getting that right. Then I would say maybe 15% of it is getting the saturation just right. And that last 5% is kind of the stuff that we talked about in the skin, using the hue versus hue controls and getting that dialed in just right to get those two cameras matched perfectly. If you want to keep your whole entire workflow within Premiere, which I totally understand. I used to use Premiere Pro for many, many years. Totally understand where you're coming from if that's the case, because, I've said this before, like switching from like Canon to Sony cameras is an adjustment, trying to get used to going from one brand to another. But going from one NLE like Premiere Pro to like Resolve and using it as an NLE, that one is a bigger decision to make because you got so much muscle memory and everything, and it's, I totally understand where you're coming from, that you just want to stay within Premiere Pro. Will it work? Like I said before, most of the time. Will it be perfect? Will we get as close as Resolve? Probably not. All right, at this point you might be thinking, I want to just like create a generic LUT that'll work on all of my Sony footage and make it look like Canon. Can I do that? And if we look at this footage right here, this is before and after we've done it, matched them up, and we've created all these nodes. Will that LUT work on all your footage? No. I would say it might sometimes, but I'd say most times it won't work. And I know that can be kind of frustrating to hear, but it really depends on like how you expose, and you got to make sure that white balance is perfect. There's a lot of different things going on. what I wanted to do with creating this course again was matching up two signals scientifically, not really selling LUTs. Now, all that said, really the answer to this, if you wanted to get Canon colors on your Sony body, would be like creating a Sony app that had all those colors in it, basically. If Canon created an app for Sony's cameras and you could install it and pay $10 for it, that would be the answer. You would get all their color scientists working on this app and making the sensor coming off of here. That would be the answer right there. Now, there is Andrew Reed over at eoshd.com. Andrew reached out to me months ago and gave me a free copy of his settings, what I think is called Sony Pro Color, I believe, or something like that, to make the Sony cameras look more like Canon. Does it work? I mean, I put two of them, Canon and Sony, right next to each other using his settings, and I've tested it many times. And does it match perfectly? No, it doesn't. Does it get close? Sometimes. Does it take care of some of the problems that the Sony cameras have? Yes. Is it similar to my situation where if I were to create a LUT from this particular image right here and you were to apply it on your footage and you'd be like, does it work? Sort of. And that's kind of what I'm saying is the very beginning of this course is LUTs don't always work. Like Andrew's settings don't always work. It's unfortunate, but that's just the reality of the situation. And basically what I wanted to do in this course is create a workflow and show you how to match up two video signals and get them matched up just perfectly and create a LUT from that. And if you needed to bring that into Premiere or Final Cut or wherever you want to work, that was the goal of this course, and not so much trying to sell a LUT. That's pretty much it. We're at the end of the course. I just want to say that I personally like the colors that come off the Canon cameras better than the Sony. But you might be of the opposite opinion. You might actually like the colors that come off of the Sony cameras better. That's totally fine. In terms of this whole entire workflow, all you have to do is basically change the reference and you'll be good to go. So that's pretty much it. I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.